Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide. I'm David Westin. Welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. On the brief today, Emma Chandra over in London on the looming Brexit vote. From Ottawa, Josh Wingrove on the Canadian election and what comes next. And Kevin Cirilli down in Washington on the continuing saga of the impeachment inquiry. So let's first go over to Emma Chandra. We have a big vote coming up, 7 o'clock, I think it is your time, 2 o'clock our time. What do we expect in Parliament, Emma?
You're right, all the action taking place in Parliament behind me, David. MPs currently in the House of Commons debating the second reading of the withdrawal agreement bill. They are due to vote on that around 7 o'clock UK time tonight. That's about 2 p.m. over in New York. Now, a vote for this is essentially a vote to say you agree with the principles of the withdrawal agreement bill and indeed the principles of the Brexit deal that was negotiated by Prime Minister Boris Johnson and the European Union. A win there would be a big victory for Boris Johnson and the EU government. But what is key is a vote that is due to come directly after that. That's a vote on what's called a programme motion. This is a vote for MPs to agree to the accelerated timetable that the Prime Minister and his government want the withdrawal agreement bill to go through in the Houses of Parliament. They want it to reach all its stages in the House of Commons by Thursday, if not by the end of the week. Now, this is the vote that is proving to be a bit more controversial. There are some MPs who think that this is too little time to debate and pass a piece of legislation as big as the withdrawal agreement bill. And we understand that the votes there are very tight, by no means certain that the government would win that vote, David. So
Emma, as I understand it, Prime Minister Johnson today said if he doesn't get his way, if he doesn't win, in fact, he has a plan B, which is a general election. Can he bring that about?
That's absolutely right. He said today that if he loses that vote on the programme motion, of course, there to try and ensure that the withdrawal agreement bill is law before the 31st of October, which is the current Brexit deadline. If he loses that vote and then the European Union offer an extension to Brexit into January of next year, he will scrap the withdrawal agreement bill. He'll no longer try and get that through Parliament, and instead he will try and go for a general election. So what we would see then for the next few days this week is various ways the government would try and call a general election. Now, we know Boris Johnson has tried to do that twice before, only last month, and he was frustrated on both accounts with MPs not allowing him to call an early general election. He has to get around something that's called the Fixed Term Parliaments Bill, and there are various ways in which he may be able to do that. But of course, if he calls a general election, it's by no means certain that MPs would allow him to have one. If he does have one, we understand it would happen before Christmas, David.
Okay, Emma, thank you so much for reporting from London. A lot of drama playing out about 2 hours from now, right behind her in Westminster. And now we go to Josh Wingrove up in Ottawa. We had the election that we talked about, Josh. As I understand it, Justin Trudeau will return to office, but not quite as strong as he was before.
Yeah, he's going to have to govern with the support of the left-leaning New Democratic Party, a sort of progressive de facto coalition, but nonetheless a win for Trudeau, who actually lost the popular vote. It was an outcome that would look familiar to Donald Trump. Trudeau lost the vote, but his vote was spread out more evenly, that he won significantly more seats than the Conservatives, the second-place party. So this means that for now, Trudeau, it's sort of status quo. He's still the Prime Minister. He'll have to name a cabinet. Then things are going to get tricky. He'll have to start negotiations with other parties. What are they going to want from him in order to support him on a vote-by-vote basis? Parliamentary committees, he won't have a majority on those. They could look in more to some of the scandals that had dropped his popularity in the first place. It's going to be a messier, rougher ride for Justin Trudeau, even though he's still in power.
So what does he want to get done with the assistance that he's going to need from at least some of the parties? What is it that's at the top of his to-do list?
Well, some of it is about keeping stuff that they'd already done. Had he lost, the national carbon price would have probably been undone. So he and the New Democrats will keep that in place. Pharmacare, which is to say a national pharmaceutical funding and availability plan, would be high on the list. The pipeline is the big flashpoint. This is the one that Trudeau bought last year and is pledging to expand. The New Democrats are opposed to this, but in past have been maybe a little flexible on whether they'd go to the wall to stop it. So that will will be one to watch. Can Trudeau still expand the Trans Mountain pipeline that the government now owns if he's needing to rely on this left-wing sort of pro-environment, anti-pipeline party to stay in power?
Okay, Josh, thank you so very much. That's Josh Wingrove reporting from Ottawa. And now we go to Washington and Kevin Cirilli. So, Kevin, not a day goes by that we don't have somebody else up on Capitol Hill talking about the impeachment inquiry. Where are we today? And how much is this getting under the president's skin? Because in that meeting of cabinet yesterday, it seemed like he was pretty irritated.
Well, President Trump earlier today using a racially charged term, lynching, to compare the impeachment process in terms of how he feels he is being unfairly targeted, in his words, his tweets, by Democrats. That said, you mentioned Bill Taylor. Bill Taylor is the top ambassador to the Ukraine for the United States, arriving there earlier today on Capitol Hill to testify before several House panels that are investigating on the impeachment inquiry. I'm told that he is seen as a key witness to many of these dealings and Rudy Giuliani conversations that pertain to U.S.-Ukraine policy. I can also tell you that, again, with that racially charged tweet that the president sent out earlier today, is receiving intense, forceful pushback from members of the Congressional Black Caucus.
Well, certainly from that, but also some Republicans coming out and really at least cautioning the president, saying, you better be careful when you use words like that, because they have some pretty explosive meanings. Is the wall of Republicans starting to erode at all on the impeachment question?
Not in terms of whether or not he should be removed from office or that he would be voted for impeachment, but definitely, David, you're absolutely correct that there has been a change in the last week or so, really ever since the Doral incident, where the president had signaled that he wanted to have it at Doral, and Syria as well, where more Republicans, prominent Republicans, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, have said and spoken out publicly against several of the president's words and actions, but no one is saying that he should be removed from office. So it's an interesting line.
Yeah, interesting is exactly the right word. Okay, thank you so much. No, that's perfect, Kevin. That's the right word. Thanks so much to Kevin Cirilli. He's our chief Washington correspondent reporting from Washington. And now let's check in on the markets. And joining us now is Abigail Doolittle. We always look to, is there any movement in the markets because of what we just talked about? There's not a lot of movement, is there, period?
Yeah, you're right about that. Not a lot of movement, period. We basically have U.S. major averages about flat, trading between small gains and losses, at least for the Dow and the NASDAQ. The NASDAQ right now, the one major that is lower, the other two slightly higher. So those macro headlines really not weighing in at this point too much. That's because we are, of course, in earnings season. A slew of earnings reports, both good and bad, to take a look at. One stock I would like to highlight, though, Facebook. It's sharply lower on the day, and this on the news that the antitrust probe by states' attorney generals has been expanded by dozens and dozens of AGs. This, of course, before Mark Zuckerberg goes to Congress, or before the House Finance panel tomorrow. That, of course, as you know, to be about Libra and housing, but it could also be a doorway to talk about antitrust issues as well.
It's hard to limit it to Libra, and
yes.
so that's certainly going to be a stock we're going to watch tomorrow. We also see trade coming up in some of the earnings I've seen. We saw it with Hasbro. We saw it at least mentioned UPS.
Yes, you're right about that. Well, relative to Hasbro, those shares having their worst day in about 20 years, and this, of course, as some of their suppliers, supply chain issues related to China because of tariffs, the threat of tariffs. They were supposed to initially happen on September 1st. Those were delayed to December 15th. You think that would be a positive, but the threat of it has really messed up their supply chain. As for some other earnings movers on the Biogen side, that stock earlier, the biotech giant, having its biggest move ever, going all the way back to 1991, not just a good quarter, but also hopes around an Alzheimer's drug. That could be very promising because, of course, there have not been any treatments there yet.
Okay, so to spring one on you, we just got a headline on Boeing, actually.
We did just get a headline on Boeing.
Is rated at negative now. It was stable. It's taken it down to negative. So the news keeps coming out on Boeing, and it's not good.
Yeah, it's not good, although the stock really not reacting. At this point, you might say that this is to some degree priced in. The stock on the day whipsawing between various gains, but they report later this week. It'll be interesting to see if their numbers are impacted at all by the news, of course, around that 737 MAX and some of the more recent revelations that perhaps the management could have done some things differently.
Yeah, there's a board meeting going on, even as we speak, down in Texas as well. But as you say, Boeing is actually up almost 2% so far.
2%, yeah.
Okay.
Could be priced in.
Okay, thanks so much to Abigail Doolittle. Now we're going to turn to Mark Crumpton, and he's here for Bloomberg First Word News.
David, the impeachment probe into President Trump continues today with testimony from the top U.S. diplomat to Ukraine. Acting U.S. Ambassador William Taylor warned it was, quote, crazy to withhold military aid in a bid to get dirt on the president's political rivals. Taylor is a key witness because of his text messages to colleagues expressing concern about back-channel Ukraine negotiation led by the president's personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani. President Trump today compared the impeachment inquiry to a lynching. A warning from British Prime Minister Boris Johnson: if Parliament defeats his Brexit proposal and votes for another delay, he'll scrap the deal and call for an election. Johnson will find out later today whether he has any chance of getting his deal approved. He'll also learn whether it can happen before the October 31st deadline. A decision on the future of Syria is coming down to a meeting between Russian President Vladimir Putin and Turkish President Recep Erdogan. The two began talks in Sochi, Russia today as the clock runs down on Turkey's 120-hour ceasefire for Kurdish fighters to leave northeastern Syria. Russia backed Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's forces in seeking to regain control of the area. President Putin may press President Erdogan to communicate directly with Damascus to try to resolve the crisis. Latin America's so-called oasis has been shaken by the worst unrest in 3 decades. In Chile, 11 people have died and more than 1,500 were arrested in a wave of arson and riots. The protests began over the subway fare hike that has since been rolled back. Now, thousands are protesting economic inequality, pensions, health, and education. President Sebastián Piñera's attempts to crack down on violence have made it worse. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and at TikTok, on Twitter, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. Coming up, UPS reported strong earnings this morning, but also a shakeup in the C-suite. We talk with CEO David Abney next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. I'm David Westin. UPS reported its third quarter earnings today, beating expectations on earnings per share, narrowly missing on revenue, but showing strong profit growth in increased efficiencies and reduced costs. We welcome now David Abney. He's the chairman and CEO of UPS. So welcome, David. Great to have you with us.
Glad to be here.
So as I say, strong earnings. What stood out for you?
The domestic operations, for sure. We actually reduced unit costs year over year by 2.5%. So every package that went through the network, 2.5% less cost, which gave us positive operating leverage as costs reduced more than the gain in revenue. So we were real happy with those results, which sets us up ideally for a good peak season this year.
Well, how'd you do it? How'd you reduce costs? 2.5%. That's pretty impressive performance.
You know, yeah, it is. Thank you very much.
I've run a couple operations, and that's not easy to do.
I know. And first, it would be our strategies. You know, we've really focused on e-commerce. We've embraced it. We leaned in because we knew this is where the world was going. And then we've made investments in automating our facilities, optimizing our dispatch, and just a lot of technology. And then it takes good, solid execution, which I'm really proud of our team for doing that. And so at the same time we grew the business, we operated at less costs, which caused us to improve operating profits in the domestic by over 25%.
We're talking with David Abney. He's the chairman and CEO of UPS. So one of the things that we're always looking at is the consumer. So talk to me about your top line. Are you seeing any softening of shipments that might indicate the consumer is going a little nervous?
You know, in the U.S., the consumer is strong, surprisingly so compared to some of what you hear. But we felt very good about that, and we're not seeing weakness at all. We would love to see industrial production, you know, increase in manufacturing. But from the consumer side, a really strong showing.
And talk about international. You emphasize domestic, U.S. shipments domestically. Talk about your international operations, because you came out of that part of UPS originally, as I recall.
I did spend 4 years as the president of international. I really loved that experience. Internationally, and we'll start with Asia, the biggest thing is trade flows and the effect of tariffs and the disputes going between the U.S. and China. What I will tell you, what we have seen is even though China exports to the U.S. have reduced, China to the rest of the world has actually increased, not to make up for the difference, but to partially offset. We are seeing some rays of hope, though, between the Chinese and U.S. governments, and we're hoping to see that resolved. And then in Europe, of course, it's Brexit and concerns of Brexit, and also the industrial sector is is a little weak in Europe too. So it's where we see.
Give us a sense of the sensitivity of UPS and your earnings, your business, to the China trade talks. What's the over and under, as it were? If it goes really, really well, what does it mean? If it doesn't go so well, what does it mean?
You know, China is a very important part of our Asian business, but it certainly would not be a big part of our overall business. So it will be influential. If trade really resumes in China, then we will, be able to fully utilize our aircraft, and it will make a difference. But it's not like it's the biggest area of the world for us. And
as you say, you made a lot of progress on costs, in part through automation, through use of technology. At the same time, you're dialing back a little bit on capital investment, your CapEx. Does that put at risk at all some of the increased efficiencies going forward?
You know, it's a great question, but the answer is absolutely not. And the reason why is we reduced, but we reduced due to the fact that we were being more efficient, and we're getting more benefit out of the capital that we are utilizing. And with each of these automation projects, we're bringing the costs down. So we actually brought down the CapEx because we were doing it with a higher efficiency and spending less money and getting more.
How far are you along in that process? If it's from 1 to 10, where are you? Are you at 2, you're at 7, you're 9?
From the automation standpoint.
Yes, from automation.
And I'll just give the U.S. as a good example of that. We are probably getting about 70% of our packages through our automated systems today. Within the next year and a half or so, we will be very close to 100% of the targeted volume. So we are progressing rapidly, and with each building, the automation's just a little better. And so that's the exciting part.
Besides your strong earnings day, you also made news in the C-suite because your chief operating officer, longtime UPS member, stepped away. Every successful company has a succession plan. Was he part of your succession plan? Do you have to change it now?
You know, Jim, by the way, first, Jim, 35 years, done an excellent job. But it's sort of a natural progression that a lot of us spend our entire working careers at the one company. And Jim has certainly done that. He's accomplished a lot. Our succession plan, I've been the CEO for 5 years. It started right after I started. It's just really a nonstop thing. And we don't talk publicly about who may or may not be candidates, but we have a deep bench and we have a good group of management. Our leadership team is in good shape, I can tell you that.
Yeah, I wasn't asking you to name names. Yeah. I wouldn't expect you to do that. But what I hear you to be saying is it doesn't change that succession plan that you had in place with your board.
No, it does not. And but again, do not want to undersell the fact that Jim's done a great job for us, and I appreciate everything he's done.
So looking forward, what's the big opportunity for UPS? What's the big challenge over the next year, 18 months?
The big opportunity is technology and the way we're implementing it. We are absolutely leading the way with drones and our drone certification from the FAA. And we formed our own drone airline, Flight Forward. And that's where we see big, big gains over the next few years.
Do you have any update on the drones? Because we talked when you first got the clearance from FAA. Where are you now?
Yeah, we've made a lot of progress. The first thing is the University of Utah Hospital is going to be the next place that we actually operate our drones. But today, or last night, we did big news, or announced big news. AmerisourceBergen, CVS, and Kaiser Permanente, all three of these big multinational healthcare companies are going to be involved in our drone partnership. So we're very excited about that.
You can't be the CEO of a big successful company without worrying about something. So I'll give you a choice, multiple choice question.
Okay.
Overall economy, U.S.-China trade. Now they're interrelated, but which one worries you more?
The China trade, just because I think it's more topical right now. And we really believe there's a way to increase trade between those two countries. We do see some positive signs. Negotiations have to continue, but that is the one that is most on my mind at this particular time.
David, it's really great to have you here in New York. Thanks to UPS Chairman and CEO David Abney. Still ahead here, tariffs are no fun and games for toy maker Hasbro. It's our company in the crosshairs next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. I'm David Westin. We have some breaking news as we come back. Shares of Lyft are rising. This is the Wall Street Journal has reported that the company is going to post a profit earlier than had been expected. Shares of fellow ride-sharing company Uber are also gaining on the news. So we could make either one of those our stock of the hour, but we have a different stock of the hour for the moment. And it is a reminder of the potential effects of the trade wars and tariffs that accompany them. Toymaker Hasbro is headed to its worst day in nearly 20 years as a big drop in margin and fall off in sales from tariffs takes its toll. And we have Abigail Doolittle to take us through it. So as we go into the Christmas season, we have more tariffs coming maybe in December. That's not so good for Hasbro.
Yes, you're right about that. We do potentially have more tariffs coming, and that is really weighing on these shares. As you mentioned, the worst day since 2000. Really pretty incredible. They missed top and bottom lines. Really badly missing, too, by double digits in the case of adjusted earnings, missing sales by 8%. So this wasn't a minor miss. One analyst saying that the degree of this miss is somewhat shocking. And as it relates to tariffs, if you recall, the tariff, the 10% toy tariff, goes into place potentially on December 15th. But initially it was supposed to go into place on September 1st. But when President Trump delayed that to December 15th, it really put their supply chain in upheaval. So people, folks in the supply chain not able to order properly, really affecting this company's revenue and profit picture.
Now, as I look at this, Abigail, I wonder if we're blaming maybe too much on trade. Certainly Hasbro mentioned trade, but the earnings were backward looking, and I don't think a lot of Hasbro's imports were subject to the tariffs.
Well, you know, that's a great question, because that was the point that I brought up immediately to one of our producers, Pete Dioteris. This doesn't really quite make sense, but the idea is that it just put the whole supply chain on hold. But you're making a point here that could be true. It could actually just be a smokescreen. It's very easy to use right now. So if they have weak results, you know, it could be blaming it on that. And of course, it'll be interesting to see whether or not, if those tariffs for December 15th are lifted as possible, whether or not that will give a pop. And this term that we're looking at right now, they have four main segments. The one bright spot in September there, you can see in gray, partner brands. They were really helped out by the Avengers Endgame franchise. They make these toys related to movies, and perhaps Frozen and Star Wars going to help in the future. It'll be interesting to see whether or not that does offset tariffs.
Yeah, and the one thing I heard through all that is Disney.
Disney.
Avengers, Frozen, Star Wars, it's all have to do with Disney. Okay, many thanks now to Abigail Doolittle. Up next, a record number of Democratic candidates took to the debate stage last week, but should we have to pick a favorite? We talk with Professor Stephen Brams of NYU, who says there's a better way to vote. We're going to talk to him about what that is and why it's better. That's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on Bloomberg Radio. From New York, this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. I'm David Westin. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell is putting the brakes on a move to impose sanctions on Turkey over its offensive into Syria. Leader McConnell says lawmakers need to be careful about using a tool that could push a NATO ally, quote, into the arms of the Russians. McConnell says he and several other Republicans are introducing a resolution that calls on President Trump to end the drawdown of U.S. forces from the area and rethink his invitation for Turkey's President Recep Erdogan to visit the White House. In Canada, voters have given Prime Minister Justin Trudeau a second term. Trudeau overcame a number of scandals and claimed what he called a clear mandate. Still, his Liberal Party lost its majority in Parliament. The most likely partner for a coalition government would be the pro-Labor New Democratic Party. Hundreds of thousands of Californians again face the prospect of another deliberate blackout. The bankrupt utility PG&E is considering a shutoff to more than 200,000 homes and businesses this week in the northern part of the state. The company is trying to keep its power lines from starting wildfires. Fatalities on U.S. roads fell for the second consecutive year and are on track to decline again in 2019. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, NHTSA, says more than 36,000 people in traffic accidents last year, down 2.4% from 2017. NHTSA attributes the drop to advanced crash prevention technology and the agency's efforts to encourage seatbelt use and curtail speeding and distracted driving. Global News 24 hours a day, on air and at TikTok, on Twitter, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks very much, Mark. When Democratic voters go to the polls for the primaries, they'll need to choose a favorite among what is likely to be several candidates in many states. And that's for their party's nomination, of course. But a professor of politics at NYU has studied the situation and concluded that there's a better way. It's called approval voting. And he's here now to explain what it is. Professor, great to have you with us.
Thank you.
So Professor Stephen Brams of NYU, explain to us what approval voting is.
Approval voting is a voting system in which, if there are 3 or more candidates, you can vote for as many as you like. So you're not restricted to voting for one. As today, we call it plurality voting. So if your favorite, for example, were a fringe candidate who has no chance of winning, you could also approve of a second choice, a more viable candidate who's likely to win. So in a way, you could have your cake and eat it too. You could vote sincerely for your favorite, the fringe candidate, but you could also vote for a second choice and be assured that probably your second choice will win, but you're expressing a preference for your first choice too.
Do you rank them? This is my first, my second, my third?
No, it's very simple. You simply approve or don't approve of each and every candidate. So we actually have a slogan, one candidate, one vote. So you make a judgment about each and every candidate. Much simpler than trying to rank candidates. People have difficulty ranking more than about 4 or 5 candidates. When there are 20, it's impossible.
So why is this a better system? I mean, you do game theory, you do analysis, you studied it. Why would this be better than what we do now?
Well, it has a number of nice properties. For example, take the 2000 election in which Ralph Nader got 3% of the vote, but he really swung the election to George Bush. Al Gore actually won by 500,000 popular votes, but we count votes by the Electoral College. So if you were a Nader supporter, you could vote sincerely for Nader, but you know Nader's not going to win, so you could cast a second approval vote for Gore, and Gore, instead of in Florida losing by 97,000 votes, by 537 votes, the 97,000 Nader voters probably would have gone about 2 to 1 for Gore. So he would have won by tens of thousands of votes rather than losing by 537, facilitated by the Supreme Court.
It sounds like it would have made a difference on your analysis in 2000.
That's
right. What about
right.
in 2016? Because that was a situation in which Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, lost the Electoral College, but there wasn't a strong third-party candidate, was there?
No, there wasn't. But I think Trump probably would not have been the Republican nominee. He was the strongest minority candidate on the right, but Governor Kasich from Ohio probably would have been approved by more Republicans, and polls show that he probably would have won the Republican nomination against Trump. What approval voting does is tend to find the moderate centrist candidate, the candidate who's more acceptable than anybody else. And if you think about it, this is the way we choose restaurants or movies when we go out with friends. What's acceptable to the most people? You don't have to be restricted to a first choice.
We're talking with Stephen Brams. He's NYU professor of politics. So this affects how many candidates you have to choose among, or who those people are on the ballot. But when you get down to the presidential election, what about the Electoral College? What do you think of that? Because we have any number of candidates who are running for president right now on the Democratic side who either want to eliminate it altogether or want to substantially amend it.
Yes, I think we should go to a direct popular vote. So votes count equally everywhere. The decisive states now, about 5 to 10, determine the outcome. If it's a close election, those 5 to 10 states, in particular Florida, for example, toss-up states that could go either way, determine the outcome. And we think that's not fair. We think votes should count the same everywhere, wherever you vote.
But as you know well, our founding fathers had a different view. It's part of the reason why we have a Senate that's not just strictly according to population. The idea was you have to have a balance between what the majority of the people overall want and make sure that various regions are represented well. If you went to popular vote, you could end up with a world where people are elected president basically just based on New York and California.
No, that's not quite accurate. We don't have a majority of the population in New York and California, and they're going to be split anyway. So I think the candidate with the most support overall, and that would have been Clinton, for example, in 2016 by almost 2 million votes. That would have been Gore in 2000 by 500,000 votes. Those candidates should be the winners. They're overall more acceptable than the candidates who did win, particularly Trump.
Is your approval voting, or the approval voting system, is it being used anywhere right now in the United States?
Yes, it was just adopted by Fargo, North Dakota, a city of over 100,000. They voted in a referendum to adopt it for the next mayoral election. It's used widely in private organizations, in universities, to choose a chair, for example. So now it's just taking off, and there's a lot of support in St. Louis, Missouri for approval voting, and they're going to vote on it soon.
Is there support among the legislators? Because one of the issues is if they're a legislator, they got elected by a given system. If they change the system, they might not get reelected.
Well, if they're moderates, they're probably actually going to be helped. So those are the people we seek out who want a more balanced system, not lurching from extreme left to extreme right in different elections.
Okay, thanks very much for being with us, Professor. That's Professor Stephen Brams. He's NYU Professor of Politics. Coming up here, Justin Trudeau apparently has 9 political lives. Despite scandal and controversy, the Canadian Prime Minister narrowly won a second term. But to get anything done, he's going to need some help from his friends. We talk with former U.S. Ambassador to Canada, Bruce Heyman. That's next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.
To my fellow Canadians, it has been the greatest honor of my life to serve you for these past 4 years, and tonight you're sending us back to work for you.
That was Justin Trudeau speaking at his victory party at Montreal last night. A victory, but a narrow victory. The Liberal Party lost both its parliamentary majority and the country's popular vote, winning 157 of the 338 electoral districts. Here to take us through what this means for Trudeau and for Canada's relationship with the United States, welcome back now former U.S. Ambassador to Canada, Bruce Heyman, coming to us today from Florida. So, Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
So I guess the first question I have is, why was it so narrow, given the fact that there was a lot that Justin Trudeau said that he would do and he did do?
So I think there's several things. First of all, I think that we're seeing this all around the world. We see it in the United States. We're seeing it in Europe, that the far right populism is really getting some momentum here. And he was facing some really populist views. In fact, one of the candidates, which fortunately didn't even win his own riding, was very Trump-like in his language of racism and immigration and climate and all of these things. So he's facing that in Canada, like the U.S., not to the same degree. And then, of course, you know, like when you govern, there's some bumps in the road, and he clearly had some missteps that he was held accountable to, both on a personal basis, but also during his governing period. So the public had to make a judgment here, but I think they did the right thing. And from someone who cares about the environment and cares about women's rights and cares about, you know, what's happening with our next door neighbor to the north, I think this was a good outcome.
So Bruce, you are a student of Canada. You lived there as ambassador, but you really have become a student of you with your wife. You've written the book on it, literally. Is correct. Canada becoming much more polarized? Because the election last night might tend to indicate that. There was a very strong turnout, particularly in the West, among the Conservatives.
I think you're right. And not only the West, but also in Quebec. I think you have a rise of the Bloc Quebec Party. And this party has 32 seats now, tripled the number of seats that they had at the bottom. And so here you have now a party that is now the 3rd largest party in Canada, and that's the Bloc from Quebec. Now you also have out west, as you mentioned, Saskatchewan and Alberta are now all conservative. And so when you have a minority government, you're going to have to learn to coalesce these various other parties and come together and do deals, get your budget passed, set your priorities, pass laws. And so it's going to be a whole new challenge for the prime minister that he doesn't have a majority and he could just put things through his own party.
Let's bring this back a little more toward home in the United States, at least, and
Yeah.
that's the USMCA, that successor to NAFTA, which is still not ratified in Congress. It has been an issue in some quarters in Canada. Is it in jeopardy from the Canadian side at this point?
Not the Canadian side. I don't think so. I am deeply concerned as to what's happening with our U.S. trade representative. And while these discussions have been very quiet, and appropriately so, between the House of Representatives and U.S. trade representative, I think he's mismanaged the calendar historically on this. He had a Republican House and Senate where he could have gotten this deal all through and wrapped up, but now he's facing a Democratic House, which has raised appropriate concerns about the flaws in this agreement and have said we need language change. They've said it for a year. We only have a couple of weeks left on the legislative calendar for the balance of this year, and he's got to get going. My bigger fear is that the president responds if this doesn't get done with the House and tears up or sends the notification on NAFTA of withdrawal. And we know from Bob Woodward's book and other interviews that that's up his sleeve, and he's wanted to do that previously. If he does that, it's on him, and the economy will be affected by it. And this is not a course that we should go.
Yeah, certainly the markets that we cover every day would be really affected if that actually happened. We're talking with Bruce Heyman. He's the former U.S. ambassador to Canada. Let's talk more generally about what Justin Trudeau is likely to try to get done in now his second term. What can he get done? He'll need, as I understand, some help from some of the other parties.
So, I think he ran on a very climate-focused policy. I think he's going to have to work with not the Conservatives, but the National Democratic Party or the Green Party or some combination of that, maybe even the Bloc from Quebec. He also has this pipeline that he's in the middle of, too. So he's got the climate on one side, but he has the pipeline on the other side that the government purchased, and he's got to figure out whether that's moving ahead. I think he's going to probably want to put through a tax cut. These minority governments are always a little tenuous because you can always lose confidence at any point in time and a new election gets called. We see what's going on in Israel where they had to call elections, because of lack of ability to put a coalition together. In this case, you have a minority government, and that if he loses confidence along the way, that there could be another election. It could be in typically 2 to 4 years for him, but he's going to have to figure out a path how to win that next time a majority. And if he does, it's going to have to be working with these other parties.
Well, does that necessarily tug him to the left some? Because the most likely party, as I understand it, for him to join forces with is somewhat to the left of him.
It just depends on the issues, and I think he's going to have to do a real balancing act here. I think on left-leaning issues, I think he's going to work on issue coalitions. And then on right-leaning issues, he's going to work with the Conservative. And so he's going to have to do this clever balancing act. It's different than a coalition government. This is by coalition by issue. So each law or each budget that he puts forward, he's going to have to build unique coalitions to support that.
You know him well. You know the situation up there terribly well. Do you think he learned a lot from this experience? Because, as I say, he had a lot of success in the policy side and then a lot of stumbles otherwise. Do you think he's going to be a better, stronger leader going forward?
I think he's better and stronger as he's moving on. We all get tested in various ways. We skin our knees at various points in time, which I think he has. I think he's gotten up, and I think he will be stronger and better this next phase just because of how much he learned in his last government. And so I think that's good news for him. I think that the Conservatives are going to have to decide whether they're going to stick with Andrew Scheer or whether they're going to select someone else to go against Trudeau.
Okay, many thanks, Bruce. Really good to have you with us. That's former
it's
U.S.
good to be back.
It's really great to have you. Okay, former U.S. ambassador to Canada, Bruce Heyman. Coming up, markets react nearly every day to how they think the U.S.-China trade negotiations are going. We go to the source and talk with the man who runs the second largest container port in the United States to find out what's going on with actual shipments of actual goods. That's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.
While we're papering the deal, and that's going well. We hope to sign it probably in Chile when we have a summit in Chile or wherever that may be. But we'll be able to, we think, sign a completed document with China on phase 1. Then we start working on phase 2. And actually, things in phase 2 are easier than phase 1.
That was President Trump talking yesterday at his cabinet meeting about trade negotiations with China. Mario Cordero is the executive director of the Port of Long Beach in Southern California, overseeing the second largest container shipping business in the United States of America. Welcome him now back to Bloomberg. So great to have you with us. Tell us where you are. When you were here last year, things were going pretty well in terms of the amount of shipments coming in and out of the Port of Long Beach. Where are they today?
Well, as you mentioned, last year we had a great year, a record year at the Port of Long Beach. Now for 2019, I think we could certainly say that the trade war has had an impact on ports, specifically in Port of Long Beach. So with that, there's a 19% reduction with regard to the China imports. And on the export side, the reduction now, when you look at the first 6 months of 2019 compared to the 6 months of 2018, year to year, that's a reduction of around 41%. So obviously the impact has hit us.
And that's China specific you're talking about now?
Absolutely.
Specifically to and from China?
No, China specific, both imports and exports.
Right. Are you making it up at all with imports and exports from other countries? Because we talk about the supply chains changing, maybe Vietnam manufacturing, maybe Mexico. Are you seeing it made up anyways?
There is some movement to Southeast Asia. In terms of what that difference is, again, 19% is the number that we've lost on Chinese imports. We've gained about 14% in other areas, Southeast Asia. So while there has been movement in other regions and other parts, it's not really equivalent to what the market has been in China.
And do you have a sense of how much of that is because of the tariffs that have been imposed already, because there are a fair number of tariffs already, as opposed to just indecision, an uncertainty, and people just holding back because they're not sure where it's going?
I think it's both. I mean, clearly for the last year, it's certainly been indecision, uncertainty in the industry. I think what you've seen now as we approach now the third and fourth quarter of the 2019 calendar year, you're now seeing actually the impact. And by that I mean, again, when you look at in terms of the impact to the Southern California, I think in that complex, the nation's largest complex, the impact has been there in terms of reduction of that number. But again, going forward, it's going to be the impact on the American consumer because again, consumption is what drives our GDP, or at least 2/3 of our GDP. And if that's impacted, then of course we are going to see an impact on the economy. So I think, last I will say this, today, when we talk about the economy, I don't think anybody who addresses what the economy will look like, whether this year, next year, or the following year, in the same sentence doesn't indicate the impact of the potential trade, the magnified impact of what we're going with that in terms of China. And again, full-blown $550 billion worth of China product value as it relates to China.
Do you see patterns when people anticipate tariffs, that they actually ship more for a period of time to try to get ahead of the tariffs? Because we have more tariffs that are right now scheduled for December 15.
Yeah. Sure. I mean, I could definitely say that the last quarter of 2018, we saw expedited cargo coming to the Port of Long Beach. Again, we had a record year in part because of the economy, but there's another factor regarding the expedited cargo that moved in anticipating of the January 1st, 2019 application of tariffs. So I suspect we're going to see something similar as we approach the December 15th implementation of the full-blown tariff on the total of Chinese-related imports.
Give us a sense of the Port of Long Beach. What percentage of your imports and exports, goods going in and out, are from Asia as opposed to other parts of the world?
Well, basically, Port of Long Beach is definitely ground zero when it comes to commerce with China. About a year ago, I would say 70% of our imports are definitely specifically from China. Today, that figure's around 68, bordering on 68. So obviously, you've seen, again, percentile-wise, an impact there. A year ago, a good amount of our exports, up to the tune of almost 40%, went to China. Today, that number is around 26%. So you can see how, again, the numbers, tell the impact most definitively.
And on imports and exports, do you see it in certain classes of goods? For example, exports. Is it agriculture? Because we've had a lot of farmers hurting in the Midwest.
Well, when you look at import and export dynamic, it's fair to say that on the export side, the impact has been more impacted there in terms more significant. Again, our reduction of imports is 41%. More specifically, in terms of California and the nation, the ag-related products, grain and so forth, are a very important factor in terms of our attempt to balance trade over the many, many years. And unfortunately, all this has happened when we've had a good economy. So the answer to your question, absolutely, the export side has been impacted.
Tell us something about the business of the Port of Long Beach. How many people do you employ? How big a business is it as a business?
Well, good question, Mark. We just released our economic impact report a few months ago. And that report basically confirms that for the city of Long Beach, 1 in 5 jobs directly and indirectly from the Port of Long Beach. But the figures in terms of the state of California, upwards of 700,000 jobs directly or indirectly related to the Port of Long Beach, commerce that goes through that port. And for the nation, that number goes up to 2.6 million. So obviously, we're not only just an economic engine, we're a job creator.
Okay. We're going to have more with Mario Cordero. He is the executive director of the Port of Long Beach. That's coming up on our second hour of Balance of Power on Bloomberg Radio. And now we have some breaking news. Russian President Vladimir Putin and Turkish President Recep Erdogan are holding a news conference right now over in Russia. A Turkish official earlier said that Russia is going to help establish a safe zone in Syria. We're going to bring you any headlines as they develop. This is a really important meeting here of the Turkish leader and the Russian leader, because as we know, Turkey wants to establish that safe zone. It will require the Syrians pulling back. It will also require displacing the Kurds. And this is the request from President Erdogan into President Putin, which has been granted. We'll bring you any more headlines as they develop. In the meantime, this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.